People often assume that I like horror because I like Gothic novels, I wear all black, and I listen to creepy neoclassical darkwave music. The assumption does not really bother me that much. I simply told them that I don't really watch horror, and one of the reasons was because I wasn't sure how to explain to them that Gothic is not exactly horror. But then what's the difference between Gothic and horror then? Well, if you want to name some Gothic novels, that's easy. There are Dracula, Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, and so many others. And for horror novels, that's not too hard. American Psycho and The Exorcist are the few examples. And can you count Dracula and Frankenstein as horror? Absolutely, but you wouldn't count Jane Eyre as horror, would you? At the same time, people wouldn't think of horror works like American Psycho, and The Exorcist as Gothic books. Actually, when it comes to horror, most people would think of movies like Halloween, The Conjuring, Child's Play, or Megan rather than novels. What people know that these two genres have in common is that they are both creepy and dark, focus on mystery and suspense, and often include ghosts or other supernatural elements. So after doing some research, I think here are 5 main differences between Gothic and horror that can help you point out which one is Gothic, which one is horror, or which one is both. Differences number 1, the origin. Gothic literature originated with the publication of the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole in 1764. Another term that people use while discussing Gothic literature is Gothic horror. Gothic horror is so well known that it is frequently used interchangeably with the word Gothic literature. But Gothic horror is a Gothic work with horror elements. Many famous classics like Frankenstein, Dracula, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde fall into the Gothic horror category. You may have heard of the Gothic romance subgenre as well. Gothic romance is a Gothic novel with a focus on romance. The novel that established this subgenre was Anne Radcliffe's A Sicilian Romance in 1790. Other well-known works are Jane Eyre and Rebecca. While Gothic is a genre, horror used to be more of an element of a story rather than a genre like how we use nowadays. Many people might argue that the first horror novel was also The Castle of Otranto, the first Gothic novel. However, horror stories existed way before that, even if they were not labeled as such. For example, you can say that grim fairy tales are horror stories. Some folklore like Japanese ghost stories or kaidan can be counted as horror, along with other ghost stories around the world. I have come across an interesting point from Chris Angelis in his Home for Fiction blog. He pointed out how we don't call Hamlet Gothic, although it includes a castle, ghosts, fear and threat, and issues related to patriarchy, the elements that are also found in Gothic books like Dracula. So, in my point of view, history is also crucial to consider. We don't usually count the story written before the Gothic literature period as Gothic. On the other hand, we don't have a finite period for when horror stories really originated. One thing to be aware is that though most scary novels and movies nowadays are in the horror genre, it doesn't mean that there are no Gothic works anymore. Although the peak era of the genre has passed, the Gothic literature hasn't completely disappeared yet. Mexican Gothic, The 13th Tale, and a series of unfortunate events are examples of modern Gothic novels. Difference number 2, the focus and the purpose. The focus of horror might be to evoke fear, but that is not always the case for Gothic stories. Like the Romanticism movement, Gothic literature emerged as a reaction to the Age of Enlightenment, which emphasized reason, science, and rationality. So Romanticism literature emphasizes emotion and individualism as well as glorification of nature instead of the reason and science, rationality. As Gothic literature developed and coexisted with the Romanticism movement, the focal point of Gothic stories is to create and explore feelings or emotions of unease, mystery, melancholy, and other extreme emotions, especially the dark aspects of human nature. Meanwhile, for something to be horror, the writer needs to at least be able to provoke fear in the audience. When compared to Gothic fiction, horror stories frequently involve more violence, gore, and psychological terror. Though by dictionary definition, terror is only defined as great fear, its meaning may extend beyond that. Terror is one of the prominent parts of horror stories. Stephen King, the king of horror stories, has mentioned how he prioritizes putting terror in his stories. Here's the quote: "I recognize terror as the finest emotion, and so I will try to terrorize the reader. But if I find that I cannot terrify, I will try to horrify. And if I find that I cannot horrify, I'll go for the gross out. I'm not proud." According to Anne Radcliffe, a Gothic novel writer, horror is the broad sensation of fear or shock. She classified terror as a heightened form of fear, triggered by suspense and the unknown, evoking a sense of anxiety. Stephen King shares a similar perspective, describing terror as a suspenseful moment in horror before the actual monster is even revealed. That's why there can be books that are Gothic but not horror, like Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Northanger Abbey. These three stories have airy and supernatural elements. However, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights are more concerned with relationships and life experiences than with horror and terror. Meanwhile, Northanger Abbey is a satire of Gothic story, not a horror story. Nonetheless, some Gothic stories can be horror. A notable example is Dracula, the story that is not only airy but also creates a sense of dread, a supernatural threat, and psychological fear from the moment Jonathan visited and tried to escape from the Count's castle to Lucy sleepwalking. And, don't make me mention Renfield and how he ate those insects. Difference number 3. Tropes. Although we know that Gothic and horror have different origins and different focuses, another easy way to differentiate Gothic and horror is to look at the tropes of each genre. First, let's list out the tropes of Gothic fiction. The common tropes in Gothic fiction are haunted locations or settings, often ancient or vintage buildings like castles or mansions, supernatural beings, a damsel in distress, mystery or suspense, past trauma like family curses or some dark history, and finally a death theme or macabre. For horror, the most common tropes are violence or gore, jump scares, the final girl, psychological terror, supernatural beings or the unknown, and the fear of death or the unknown itself. Though these are just tropes and common elements, not the perfect checklist, I think by looking at this, you can tell vaguely what is Gothic, what is horror, or what can fall into both category. Difference number 4. The romance. The distinction between Gothic and horror is that you don't anticipate romance to be the major storyline or major storytelling in horror stories, whereas romance can be the main plot in Gothic. When we talk about romance stories, we usually expect the relationship to be the main focus. We want to see a love story and a happily ever after, or at least a happy for now. However, in Gothic novel, romance doesn't solely mean a happy love story. The Gothic romance subgenre often involves affairs, forbidden love, and complex relationships. But here is the tricky part. Even though we don't watch horror for romance, and relationships are often included as more of a secondary element of the horror story, I cannot say that the horror stories that can be counted as romance story doesn't exist. The horror stories that are categorized as romance are Crimson Peak, well, which one is also Gothic as well, Let the Right One In, and Warm Bodies. However, as a very generic distinction, romance often works as a secondary element in horror while it can be the main focus in Gothic novels. Number 5. Morality. Believe it or not, one thing that makes Gothic differ from horror is how Gothic implements moral lesson into their narrative. In Gothic literature, morality often plays a central role in shaping the character's action. Gothic stories usually explore themes of good versus evil, the consequences of immoral behavior, or even the consequences of straying from social norms. Though I cannot confirm this, one reason why many Gothic books include morality in their story could be that most Gothic literature was published during the Victorian era, the period of strict moral codes. Though horror stories can incorporate morality into the story, they are not required to do so. Still, the absence of moral themes doesn't make horror stories shallow. In fact, many horror stories have unique concepts, many creative ways to tap into the darkest corners of audience imagination, and use understanding of human fear for extremely emotional storytelling. So, what do we get from here? I think the easiest way to identify if a story is horror is to, first, see if the story aims to scare the audience or not. Then you can check the major elements to see if it fits the Gothic genre. One thing to consider though is that what is horrifying for one person may not be horrifying for another person. So in the same manner, what is horrifying for people in the Victorian era, like the concept of damnation, may not be as scary to people in modern days. So if a horror story fails to scare you, it could be a terrible horror story, or it could be just the fear-provoking aspects may not resonate with you. While both genres are dark, horror emphasizes fear and terror, whereas Gothic focuses on the eerie and mysterious atmosphere. And if you want to be more sure, you can look at when the story was written and how the story uses romance and moral lessons in the narrative. That's how Gothic stories about monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein are both Gothic and horror. Jane Eyre is Gothic but not horror because it doesn't evoke fear. And while It, American Psycho, The Exorcist, Halloween, The Conjuring, Child's Play, and Megan may have dark elements and overlap with Gothic themes, they focus more on the fear-provoking aspects, and most of these works lack traditional Gothic elements like ancient, gloomy, decaying settings and atmosphere, so these are horror but not Gothic. Still, while genres help us in making it easier to find another book or movie with similar themes, some work may blur the boundaries between genres, so sometimes it is impossible to set a concrete rule. Since this video is made from the perspective of someone who is more of a Gothic fan, it would be nice to hear insight from horror fans or those who enjoy both Gothic and horror as to what additional differences you have found. Again, thanks for being here. I hope you have a nice day, and I hope to see you on the next journey.